No, perfect.
I'll give this best speech of the night.
That's right. Order. Members, at the break we were debating part 3 and the debate had just commenced. Pesata Sam Loto Inga had the call and he has 2 minutes and 38 seconds remaining. Should he wish to take it? It appears not. Chris Hipkins.
Thank you very much, Mr.
For
Chair.
an uplifting speech.
What was that?
For an uplifting speech.
For an uplifting speech. I'll do my very best to get the House back in order after the dinner break, Mr. Chair. Very happy to take a call on this part 3 that we've just started debating part 3 after a very lively and informative debate, I think, on the first 2 parts of the bill. This part of the bill, part number 3, is all about the lines companies. And, Mr. Chair, I think that this highlights the higgledy-piggledy mess of the electricity system that the national government made back in the late 1990s when they tried to create an artificial market in a situation where effectively there is a monopoly. So let's go back through the history books. Before the Electricity Industry Bill, I believe it was named the same as this bill that we have here. Before the Electricity Industry Bill of about 1997, we had the local energy boards who were responsible for distributing electricity to consumers, and we had the Electricity Corporation of New Zealand who generated the electricity that was supplied. And what Max Bradford did was he decided that there needed to effectively be 3 main components to the market. There needed to be the retailers who would sell the electricity to the consumer. There needed to be the lines companies who would supply the electricity to the consumer. And then there needed to be the generators who would create the electricity in the first place. And there needed to be competition in those markets. Now, obviously, in the case of lines companies, very difficult to create a market in the lines company area because they are monopolies. And we're never going to have 2 sets of electricity lines running past every house and every business in the country. In fact, we wouldn't even want to have 2. It just wouldn't make any commercial sense to have a competing electricity grid. In a country like New Zealand, we're only ever going to have 1 electricity grid. In fact, I'm not aware of anywhere else in the world, someone may be able to correct me, where there's more than 1 electricity grid. So being very clear about the fact that these are this is a monopoly situation. The lines companies are monopolies, and in fact the transmission grid is going to be a monopoly, run by Transpower in the case of the New Zealand transmission grid. So making sure, if we're going to say that we're going to have competition in the retail market and competition in the generating market, there needs to be some separation between those 2 markets and the natural monopoly that is the lines company. So what Max Bradford said is that you couldn't, if you're a lines company, the energy boards had to decide whether they were going to be lines companies or retailers. And if they were going to be retailers, then they needed to divest themselves of their lines businesses, or vice versa. And so what we ended up with was separate lines companies, separate retailers, separate generators. Now, of course, that didn't result in what Max Bradford promised everybody. He promised them that would lead to lower power prices. And in fact, we all know over the last 12 years, power prices have continued to go up by a pretty substantial amount. So what we're faced now with is how do we deal with this situation and what improvements can be made after 12 years of the operation of the market. Now, Labor supports moves to get increased retail competition because if that helps to lower prices, that's got to be good for consumers, those at home who are going to be paying their power bills, have seen their power bills going up, and will be saying, how can we lower the power bills? How can we get a bit more money back in our own pockets, not given over to the power companies? Increased competition in the retail market may well help with that. However, I'm not convinced that allowing lines companies back into the retail market is going to actually deal with that problem because of the monopoly status that they have, and because in fact some of the evidence presented to the Select Committee was that if a lines company is allowed to enter the retail market, far from increasing the number of players in the retail market in that area, it could actually distract other retail competitors from entering that market because of the way the lines company has a monopoly in that, could have a monopoly in that area, supplying both the product, if you like, and the delivery mechanism. So I'm not convinced that this is going to make a difference. I'm not convinced that this is going to lower the price of power. Have faith, John Carter says. That's what Max Bradford said. I say to John Carter, Max Bradford said, have faith, I know what I'm doing, it's all going to be all right, we're going to have lower power prices. And what happened? Power prices went up exponentially because of what Max Bradford did. He divided up a monopoly. It is a monopoly, and tried to create a market where there is really a monopoly. Very difficult to do, because you can only have one set of lines, you'll only have one transmission grid. Mr. Chairman.
I call Chris Hipkins.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I'm winding up shortly anyway. But so Max Bradford, as John Carter just said, told us that we all had to have faith. We all had to have faith in the market. The market was going to deliver lower power prices. It did not do that. Now, Mr. Chair, the question becomes, what do we do about lines companies at the moment? Do we allow them back into retailing? What other commercial opportunities are there for lines companies? Lines companies could be focused, first of all, on making sure their infrastructure is up to date, making sure that they're replacing the power lines and so on. A good example, a good comparison, is the rail industry. We sold off the rail network in the 1993, I think it was, that the then national government sold the rail network. And during that time, the overhead power cables that power the rail network were not maintained at all. So in the Wellington region, by the time that a government bought back the rail tracks in 2003, the power network supplying the electricity to the trains was so badly run down that in the last few years it's effectively had to be completely replaced. So the question I've got for the lines companies, why don't they focus on doing that, on making sure that they are providing a network that is going to deliver security of supply to households in the future? Because we have seen examples where things have gone wrong. It took a D-shackle, was it D-shackle, I think that's what they call it, to wipe out the power supply to a large chunk of Auckland for several days. So clearly maintaining the lines is what the lines companies should be focused on. They should be focused on making sure that when people go home, put a pot on the stove, turn their light switch on, that the power's actually going to be there, that they're going to be able to do those things, because electricity is so fundamental now to what we do on a daily basis. There are other commercial opportunities for lines companies if they want to look at expanding their businesses into other areas. There's opportunity for lines companies, for example, to get involved in telecommunications, particularly in broadband. And there must be opportunities there that if they wanted to get involved in broadband, I know the government's kind of stalled with where they're going with broadband at the moment, and we're not making anywhere near the progress that they're making in Australia when it comes to broadband, of course, but that's because they have a Labour government and we have a national one. So, Mr. Chair, there are plenty of other opportunities for lines companies in terms of where they could diversify their businesses if they want. I'm not convinced that allowing them to move into the retail market is going to increase competition. In fact, as I said before, allowing them into the retail industry could put off other providers from entering into that market. So, to recap, what this bill does is it repeals part of Max Bradford's ideological separation of the generators, the lines companies and the retailers. It allows the lines companies to enter into retailing under certain conditions. There will be restrictions on the amount of electricity they can supply and so forth. Overall, however, I'm not convinced that it's going to make much of a difference, Mr. Chair. Thank you.
Chairman.